Alexa, how do I make a YouTube channel?
I don't know. But making more than one video a year probably wouldn't hurt.
Well, that was rude, but she's not wrong. I do need to make more than one video a year, and I'm going to, starting right now. Hey guys, Dave here with Diabolical Props, and before we dive into the Hilda build, I would like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So as you can tell, there's been some changes. Nothing super major, I just moved apartments, and I ended up getting a bigger spare bedroom, and so now the workshop is bigger and a little flashier, and I've learned how to make a camera look a little bit better. So, elephant in the room now being addressed, guys. I think I'm ready to start making YouTube videos more than once every 14 months. Woo! I'd also like to take just a quick second to remind everybody that I stream over on Twitch every Tuesday evening, and you can also find me on all of my socials and on Discord, where I'm actually going to be posting the free pattern for this video. So, if you want to find those, the link is in the description below, and I'd hope to see you there. Come on, it's a lot of fun. You might like it. Or not. All right, with all of that now out of the way, let's talk about this sword. So a couple weeks ago, my girlfriend came to me and said that she really wants to go as Hilda to San Diego Comic-Con, and to accompany her, she would like Hilda's sword from the newest season of the show on Netflix. And so being the super duper cool boyfriend that I am, I made it for her. If I'm being honest, it really wasn't that difficult of a project. The sword gets a lot of screen time in the episodes that it's in, and that made making a pattern just that much easier. So, let's talk about how I built this thing. To kick things off, I knew I was going to need a pattern, so I started by watching the episodes that the sword appears in to find reference images. Once I found some images that I liked, I simply uploaded them to Inkscape and drew my pattern. Once I had the pattern drawn and scaled to a size I liked, I simply took it down to FedEx and printed it on some large form paper. Once I had my crisp new pattern printed, I laid it out and cut out just the blade section before tracing it onto my foam. Now I knew I needed the blade to be pretty sturdy, so I traced it out 3 times on some 10mm HD foam. Once I had my pattern traced, I cut out all 3 sections of my blade sandwich, and on the middle section I made sure to trace my core. For this I used an aluminum rod, but you could use whatever you like. With my core traced, I used a sharp utility knife to cut out the trench for my rod. Trench for my rod. Once I had my trench cut out, I test fit my rod before fastening it in with hot glue. With my rod now in place, all I had to do was use contact cement to close the top and bottom layers of my blade sandwich. To attach the aluminum rod to the PVC pipe reducer that I planned on using inside the hilt, I took a wooden dowel and stuffed it into some 1/2-inch PVC pipe. I cut a 1-inch section of this before drilling a hole in the center to accommodate the aluminum rod. With my homemade adapter now made, I was able to use some good old Bob Smith Industries super glue to attach it to the aluminum rod before using that same super glue to glue the adapter into the PVC pipe reducer. Now that the reducer for the hilt was attached, I was able to cut off the excess aluminum rod. Next, I separated the hilt section and the handle section of my pattern. With the pattern of my hilt now cut out, I traced it onto some 10mm foam. I then cut out the piece that I had just traced, used contact cement to attach it to another piece of 10mm foam, cut it out again, and I repeated this step until I had a stack of about 5 10mm pieces, all in the shape of the hilt that I wanted. While the contact cement was drying on the hilt, I measured and cut out a piece of 3/4-inch PVC pipe for the handle. To be able to fit the reducer and the PVC pipe handle inside the hilt, I marked the center line on the top and bottom of the hilt and then drilled a hole through it with a 1 1/4-inch Forstner bit. Your results will obviously vary, but I found that the 1 1/4-inch Forstner bit made a hole tight enough for the reducer, but not so tight as to distort the foam of the hilt. You'll just need to play around with what you have access to and find what works for you. With the hole for my hilt now drilled, I was ready to move back over to my blade. I began by using the pattern to mark my center lines, as well as the center lines for my edges. I then used a really sharp utility knife to stay within those 2 lines as guidelines as I hand beveled the edge. With the edges of my blade now rough beveled, I was able to use a large sanding drum on my rotary tool to finish out the beveling. All right, let's take a second. Now, just because I used a large sanding drum on my rotary tool doesn't mean you have to use a large sanding drum on your rotary tool. If you have access to something like a belt sander, a disc sander, or some sort of like oscillating spindle sander, feel free to use any of those. I just happen to have the large sanding drum on hand, and that's what I went with. I found that it gave me a really good sense of control for this project, but there's a million ways that I could have done it. So it really is just about experimenting with different tools and finding a way of doing it that you like. Having said all that, let's go back to the build. I was now ready to begin working on my pommel. I used contact cement and 4 scrap pieces of 10mm foam to make a stack. I then traced the pommel section of my pattern out on the stack and cut it out with a sharp utility knife. This could have easily been done on the bandsaw just like with the hilt, but for this part of the project, I just used the utility knife. Next, I used some sandpaper to scuff up the surface of the PVC pipe for the handle before prepping it with contact cement and applying a layer of 4mm EVA foam. Once the EVA foam had been applied to the handle, I simply used my rotary tool to knock down the seam line. With the wrap of the handle now applied, I used my rotary tool to begin matching the contoured shape that the handle has on the pattern. Once I had my handle to a shape that I liked, I used some Bob Smith Industries super glue to apply a 10mm half round dowel just below where the foam of the handle ends. This part of the build isn't actually super crucial because I ended up replacing this half round dowel with a larger one later in the project. With my handle now coming along, I was ready to begin cleaning up my pommel. I used the rotary tool to clean up some of the edges and round the corners. Later in the project, we're going to use the rotary tool to completely bevel and round the edges, but we're not quite there yet. With that now out of the way, I was ready to test fit the blade, hilt, and handle sections of my sword. I also used this as an opportunity to trace the base of the blade out onto the hilt. I was able to use a small sanding drum in my rotary tool to create a slight trench where the blade can rest in. Once I was happy with how deep the trench was, I used some Bob Smith Industries super glue to attach the hilt to the blade. Next, I took the blade section of the pattern that depicts the viney decorative portion, and I separated that out into its different pieces. Next, I made some registration marks on those different sections of the pattern and then traced them out on some 5mm EVA foam. I then made sure to flip these sections of the pattern over and trace them a second time. This will give me the pieces for the other side of the blade. I then cut all the pieces out with my sharpened utility knife. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Jimmy's mom. Happy birthday to you. Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the crew. I make props, and now so do you. I then used my rotary tool and a small sanding drum to begin rounding over just the top edges of all the different sections of the viney decorative portion thingy. Once I had all the top sections of the vines rounded, I used contact cement to attach all the vine sections together using the registration marks I made earlier for reference. Once I had all the vine sections attached together, I then traced them out onto the blade, making sure that both sides were symmetrical. I then used contact cement to attach them to the blade. Once I had the 2 decorative sections of my blade attached and symmetrical, I used my pattern to mark where the notches and dings in the tip of the blade needed to be. I then used a really sharp utility knife to cut those notches out. With my sword now really starting to come together, I was ready to move on to some of the finer details. I took the pommel section of my pattern and a really sharp X-Acto knife and carefully removed the decorative lines from the center of the pommel section. I then traced those lines onto the pommel itself and got ready to burn them in with my soldering iron. Now, it really needs to be said that this portion of the build can be done a number of ways. You can use the X-Acto knife to very lightly score the lines in and then use a heat gun to open them up. I just found that I got a better result using the soldering iron. Now, the soldering iron produces a lot of smoke and gas, so you're going to need to do this outside or in an extremely well ventilated area with a respirator. Once I had all the lines traced out for my pommel and my hilt, I then got my soldering iron out and set the settings very high, somewhere close to around 600 degrees, put my respirator on, opened a window, turned on a fan, and began very carefully burning the details into the two sections of foam. Once I had the lines and details etched in how I liked, I was ready to move on to cleaning up the rest of the sword. I used my rotary tool and a small sanding drum to begin giving the pommel its final bevel rounded look, as well as cleaning up both the edges of the vines as well as the edges of the hilt. It was during this cleanup effort that I realized that the half-round dowel that I had placed at the base of the handle earlier wasn't as big as I would have liked it, so I used some contact cement to go over it and cover it with a much larger 15mm dowel. I also used contact cement in this exact same type of half-round dowel to cover up the portion of the reducer that was protruding out the bottom of the hilt. With that piece now attached, I was ready to use some Bob Smith Industries superglue to permanently attach the pommel to the base of the handle. With the pommel now attached, the entire sword's construction was complete, and I was ready to test fit everything together. To test the 5-foot rule, I did some cheesy posing in front of the camera, and I was so happy with how everything turned out. Once I had gotten my ego a little in check and turned the camera off, I ended up noticing that the hilt had received some damage from the drill press. I didn't get any good footage of the damage itself, but to fix the process, I took some EVA foam clay and just mushed it down into the damage, let it wait 24 hours, and then cleaned it up with the palm sander. You can see me doing that here, but if you would like to see that process further, I can make that its own video. With the sword now constructed, patched, and repaired, I was ready to move on to final painting and finishing. To kick this process off, I took the sword outside and did 5 to 6 layers of spray-on black Plasti-Dip. I started off the painting process with some iridescent bronze acrylic paint by Golden Brand. I took a large flat brush and very lightly dipped it into the paint and carefully dabbed it all along the surfaces that needed to be bronze. This included the hilt, the pommel, the 2 dowels, and the vine decorative section on the blade. When painting metallic sections of a prop like this, it's very easy to overdo it with the paint. That's why I recommend doing multiple very light stippling passes with not very much paint on the brush. This allows the black to show through and also gives you the ability to dial in how much age you want to show. Once I had done enough stippling passes to get the bronze how I liked, I then cleaned my brush and began doing the exact same steps with Golden Brand's iridescent deep gold acrylic. Once I had done enough stippling passes to get the bronze how I liked, I then cleaned my brush and began doing the exact same steps with Golden Brand's iridescent deep gold acrylic. Since a lot of metals used in weapons and armor are actually alloys, alternating between these two metallic paints will give us a very warm, authentic, aged metal feel. Now that I have my bronze sections looking really nice, I take a flat brush and a small amount of black acrylic paint and just began lightly cleaning up any of the areas that I may have overpainted. Once the black paint had had time to dry, it was time to finally begin painting the blade. Similarly to how I painted the hilt, pommel, and vine sections, the blade was going to consist of 2 different metallic paints. The first paint that I used was Plaid FX's Samurai Sword. This is a nice dark silver metallic that I think sets a really good base coat for other metallics to go on top of. To apply this first coat, I took a large mop brush, dipped it in the Samurai Sword paint, used a paper towel to remove most of it off, and then, instead of dry brushing it, stippled it on in a similar fashion that I did for the bronze sections. Once I applied this base coat to a level that I liked, I cleaned and dried my brush and repeated this stippling method with some of Plaid FX's Chainmail. This is a lighter colored silver acrylic that I think accents the undercoat very well. To finish out the blade, I needed to get these metallics into the areas in between the vines of the decorative section. To do this, I used a small flat brush and alternated between the silver paints. With the blade now painted and shiny, the only thing left to do was to paint the handle to look as if it was wrapped in leather. To accomplish this, I took some of Folk Art's burnt sienna acrylic paint and a flat brush. I lightly dipped the flat brush in the paint, removed most of it, and in a dry brushing fashion, stippled the paint on for the first layer. It took a couple passes to get the layer how I liked, but once it was there, I allowed it to dry and repeated this step with some raw sienna by Folk Art. I found that alternating between these 2 paints gives you the ability to dial in a very realistic leather texture. It looks good in this application as well as things like armor and other props. 2 years of streaming on Twitch. What do I even do? With the raw sienna now dialed in, the paint job for Hilda's sword was officially complete. Normally this would be the step in the process where I take the sword outside and hit it with some sort of clear coat, but I wanted to keep the aged look that this sword had in the show. So any damage that it receives on the convention floor, I'll just be touching up here and there as needed. Well, that's about it, you guys. I have to say, of the projects that I've done in the last year, this might have been the most fun. Definitely been the most accurate. And I can say through all steps of the process, getting addicted to the show with my girlfriend, looking for reference images, doing the pattern, the construction, the paint job, it's all just been fun. And if you know me and you've seen the channel or maybe done your own cosplay props, you know that there's sometimes a point in the project where it becomes a chore. There's either a new skill that you haven't learned or you reach a part that just doesn't go right. And I really didn't encounter that much with this project. It's just been a blast. Like being able to see something on the screen, reach in and pull it out into the real world, and then just be, you know, very happy with the result has just been great. And thank you guys so much for being here for it. My girlfriend was actually able to use this recently in a convention. That's right. She walked the convention floor with her giant sword and she had a blast. This was her first ever convention, and we have the weapons check badge to prove it. Going into weapons check, I was 99% sure that this was going to pass, but you never know. And to see her have something that made the experience for her, made the experience for me. So it was just so fun getting to interact with her in her Hilda costume and getting to see the sword in action. And with that, I think I'm going to conclude my pontification. Pontificating? Is it pontificating? If you know how to use the word pontificate in a sentence, please Google it and then put it in the comment section below, because I really don't think I'm using that word correctly. In the meantime, if you would like to stay up to date on what I'm doing, I've got my Instagram and all my other socials linked down below, right next to a Discord where you can join us and meet some really interesting people, share your photos, ask your questions, let us know when you're going live or post new content. And it's also where we're going to be housing free patterns like the one we did for this project. You can also follow me over on Twitch. I'd like to remind you, I go live every Tuesday evening. And it's a great place to come hang out, watch me work on stuff, share your pictures, make new friends, and get all warm and fuzzy with some other really great makers just like yourself. And so yeah, gang, without any further ado, I'm going to say thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for being here, and remember, if I can do it, you can do it. Make it easy, everybody. Thanks for being here.